Let's start with something that should be impossible. In 1902, workers digging a foundation in Seattle's Pioneer Square hit something unexpected: an entire city, perfectly preserved, sitting one story below the modern streets. Buildings with ornate facades, sidewalks, storefronts, all buried beneath what we call ground level today. The official explanation? The Great Seattle Fire of 1889 destroyed the old city, so they simply built on top of the ruins. Raise the streets, start fresh, move on. Except here's the problem. That's not an isolated incident. It's happening everywhere. San Francisco has buried neighborhoods beneath Chinatown. Chicago's downtown sits atop an entire grid of earlier streets. Savannah, Georgia, literally raised itself 12 feet and built over what was already there. Boston, Montreal, Edinburgh. The list stretches across continents. These aren't ancient ruins from forgotten civilizations. These are 19th century structures, some less than 100 years old when they were buried, entombed beneath the modern world as if someone wanted them hidden. And here's what makes it strange. Nobody seems to question why this happened in dozens of major cities within the same narrow time window. The standard narrative says progress, urban renewal, fire damage, flooding. Each city offers a convenient local explanation that sounds reasonable in isolation. But when you line them up on a timeline, when you see the pattern repeating with unsettling precision across North America, Europe, and Asia, something else emerges. Something that doesn't fit the comfortable story we've been told. So let's do what historians apparently won't. Let's examine the evidence without assuming the conclusion. Let's look at what was buried, when it happened, and who benefited from erasing what came before. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. The first anomaly appears in the architecture itself. These buried structures weren't primitive. Walk through Seattle's underground tour today and you'll see ornate stonework, arched doorways, craftsmanship that would cost millions to replicate now. The same pattern emerges in every buried city. The older layer consistently shows superior construction techniques, more elaborate design, massive stonework that modern builders struggle to explain. In Chicago, beneath the raised streets, you'll find buildings with foundations suggesting structures far taller than the modest buildings that supposedly stood there, as if something larger was cut down to size before being buried. But here's where it gets strange. The timeline doesn't work. The Great Chicago Fire happened in 1871. Within a single decade, the entire downtown was not only rebuilt, but raised an entire story, creating a buried city beneath. That means they simultaneously cleared millions of tons of fire debris, constructed new buildings, and engineered a complete street raising system across dozens of blocks, all while maintaining a functional city. The labor required would be staggering. The coordination would be unprecedented. Yet we're told this happened smoothly, efficiently, in multiple cities at once, during an era when construction moved at a fraction of modern speed. Take San Francisco. After the 1906 earthquake, rather than simply clearing rubble and rebuilding at street level, they chose to raise entire neighborhoods, burying what remained beneath. But photographs from before the earthquake show many of these buildings had already been partially buried. Windows that should have been first-floor entrances were already basement level, as if the burial process had started before the disaster that supposedly necessitated it. The earthquake became the justification for completing what was already underway. Now look at the global pattern. Between 1850 and 1920, a 70-year window, dozens of major cities across different continents all experienced the same phenomenon: catastrophic fires, floods, or earthquakes, followed immediately by massive urban renewal projects that bury the previous layer. Boston's Beacon Hill neighborhood was lowered by 50 feet, the earth redistributed to fill in Back Bay. The official story says this was planned urban development, but that means they deliberately demolished and buried perfectly functional 19th century buildings to make room for more 19th century buildings. The math doesn't math. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Disaster strikes. The response isn't simply to rebuild, it's to bury and replace, to erase what existed before. And in every case, what gets buried shows architectural sophistication that supposedly didn't exist yet. Massive stone foundations, advanced drainage systems, Evidence of construction techniques that challenge our understanding of 19th century capabilities. Here's what they don't show you in history textbooks. Many of these buried cities contain structures that don't match the timeline. In Montreal's underground city, exploratory work has revealed foundations suggesting buildings much older than official records indicate. Seattle's underground contains architectural elements, specific types of stonework, particular construction methods, that historians attribute to periods either too early or too advanced for the official chronology. When researchers ask about these inconsistencies, the silence is deafening. Now, if you're thinking this sounds impossible, that surely historians would have investigated these contradictions, that's exactly the response that keeps this pattern hidden. It sounds too big to be real, so we don't look. But before you dismiss this, subscribe to this channel, because what we're about to uncover gets exponentially stranger. The buried cities are just the visible evidence. The real question is what those cities tell us about who built them and why someone wanted them erased. Let's talk about maps. Historical maps from the 1700s and early 1800s show cities with detailed street grids, established infrastructure, architectural landmarks, all supposedly built by small colonial populations with limited resources. The official story says pioneers carved these elaborate urban centers from wilderness in just decades. But here's the problem: the math doesn't work. Building a single ornate stone structure requires quarrying, transporting, cutting, and assembling tons of stone. The tools of that era were primitive by modern standards. The population was a fraction of what it is now. Yet we're told they casually constructed entire cities of elaborate buildings while simultaneously farming, defending against conflicts, and establishing basic survival infrastructure, unless they didn't build them, unless these cities were already there. The Tartarian hypothesis suggests an alternative timeline, that an advanced civilization with sophisticated architectural knowledge existed before our recorded history, that these structures we attribute to 19th century settlers were actually inherited from this earlier culture, and that the burial of these cities represents a deliberate campaign to erase evidence of what came before. Now stay with me, because whether you accept that hypothesis or not, the evidence demands explanation. Look at the construction techniques in these buried layers. Many employ massive granite blocks fitted with precision that modern engineers struggle to replicate. The official timeline says 19th century workers, using horse-drawn equipment and basic tools, somehow moved and placed stones weighing multiple tons with tolerances measured in millimeters. Then, mysteriously, that capability disappeared. Modern construction can't achieve the same precision without advanced machinery. How did our technological capabilities somehow regress? The pattern of worldwide disasters provides another troubling data point. Between 1850 and 1920, the same 70-year window when cities were being buried, we see an unprecedented spike in catastrophic urban fires. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871, Boston's Great Fire of 1872, the Seattle Fire of 1889, Baltimore in 1904, San Francisco in 1906. These weren't scattered across centuries, they clustered within decades. And in each case, the response was identical: bury what survived and build anew. But here's what makes it impossible to ignore. Many of these fires displayed anomalous characteristics. The Chicago fire allegedly started in a barn but somehow melted stone and metal across the city. Witnesses reported flames that behaved unlike normal fires, heat intense enough to vitrify materials, destruction patterns that don't match typical urban conflagrations. The same reports emerged from other major fires of that era. Anomalous heat, unusual flame behavior, damage that exceeded what wood and coal fires should produce. Now add another layer. During this same period, we see the systematic demolition and replacement of massive structures that official history claims were recently built. Entire exhibition buildings from world's fairs, elaborate temporary structures supposedly constructed in months, then demolished immediately after the events concluded. Except photographs show these weren't temporary buildings. They displayed permanent construction, massive foundations, architectural detail far beyond what makes sense for short-term use. The 1893 Chicago World's Fair featured hundreds of ornate buildings, all supposedly built specifically for a 6-month exhibition, then destroyed. The labor and resources required would rival constructing an entire city for a temporary fair, unless those buildings weren't new. unless they were already there, repurposed for the exhibition, then demolished to hide their true origin. The World's Fairs themselves become suspicious when examined as a collective pattern. Between 1850 and 1920, dozens of major exhibitions occurred worldwide, each featuring elaborate architectural complexes that appeared rapidly, hosted millions of visitors, then vanished completely. The official narrative says each host city mobilized unprecedented resources to construct these temporary monuments to progress. But here's the pattern. Many fair sites corresponded exactly with areas where buried cities would later be discovered. The fairs provided cover for demolition. The fires provided justification for burial, and the modern cities rising above erased what came before. Look at the photographic evidence from these fairs. The buildings don't look temporary. They look ancient and permanent. Massive stone facades, elaborate carved details, construction that would take years with period-appropriate methods. Yet we are told workers assembled these complexes in months, used them briefly, then demolished them completely. The cost would be astronomical, the waste inexplicable. Unless the real purpose wasn't celebration, it was elimination. But here's where the evidence cascade accelerates. Those World's Fair buildings, those buried city structures, they share architectural characteristics with buildings worldwide that official history attributes to different eras and cultures. The same design motifs appear in supposedly unrelated structures across continents, specific types of columns, particular ornamental patterns, consistent construction techniques, as if they all emerged from the same architectural tradition, a tradition that official history says never existed. The Tartarian hypothesis names this lost tradition. It suggests these consistent design elements represent a unified global civilization that predated our current historical framework, that the structures we attribute to various 19th century builders were actually inherited from this earlier culture, and that the coordinated burial of cities represents systematic suppression of this evidence. The alternative is accepting that dozens of disconnected cities independently decided to bury themselves, using similar methods within the same 70-year window, for conveniently timed local reasons. Coincidence stretched beyond breaking point. Now I know what the skeptics will say. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, but that's the point. The evidence is extraordinary. It's sitting beneath our feet in dozens of cities. It's visible in thousands of photographs from World's Fairs that showed buildings too elaborate to be temporary. It's documented in architectural surveys that reveal construction techniques that shouldn't exist in the official timeline. The evidence is overwhelming. What's missing is institutional willingness to investigate what it means, and that silence might be the most damning evidence of all. Because when you ask mainstream historians about these patterns, they don't engage with the evidence. They don't offer alternative explanations for why cities buried themselves. They simply dismiss the questions as conspiracy thinking and move on. But that's not how legitimate historical inquiry works. When evidence contradicts the established narrative, real historians investigate. They don't ignore it. So why the institutional silence? If the explanations are as simple as fire damage and urban renewal, why not address the inconsistencies directly? Why not explain how 19th century workers achieved precision stonework that modern engineers struggle to replicate? Why not account for the impossible timelines? The silence is deafening. And silence, in the face of documented anomalies, suggests something more than simple oversight. Which brings us to the implications. If you're still with me, hit that subscribe button now, because this is where we connect the buried cities to the larger pattern of historical suppression. What we've established isn't speculation. It's observable, documented, verifiable. Cities were buried. Architecture was destroyed. Evidence was erased. The question is why? The Tartarian hypothesis provides one framework for understanding this suppression. It suggests that acknowledging a previous advanced civilization would fundamentally destabilize our understanding of human history, technological progress, and civilizational development. It would mean admitting that we descended from something greater, that we're not the pinnacle of human achievement, that massive knowledge was lost. The implications would cascade through every academic discipline. Archaeology would need to reassess every site. Historians would need to re-examine every timeline. Our entire narrative of human progress would require revision. That's threatening to established institutions. Academic careers are built on accepted chronologies. Museum collections are organized around established narratives. Textbooks, grants, reputations all depend on maintaining the consensus view. Acknowledging the buried cities as evidence of something other than simple urban renewal would require confronting how much we don't know, how many assumptions underpin our historical framework, how fragile our certainty actually is. But the suppression goes beyond academic comfort. There's a power element at play. Our current civilization derives legitimacy from the narrative that we represent the height of human achievement, that we've progressed linearly from primitive to advanced, that our technological and social systems represent evolutionary improvement. If an earlier civilization achieved sophistication we can't match, if we're living in the ruins of something greater, that narrative collapses. The authority of our institutions becomes questionable. The inevitability of our systems becomes suspect. Look at what happened to researchers who push too hard on these questions. They don't get mainstream platforms. They get marginalized, labeled conspiracy theorists, excluded from academic discourse. Not because their evidence is weak, many present rigorous, well-documented cases, but because the implications of that evidence are too disruptive. It's easier to dismiss the messenger than engage with the message. And here's what makes it insidious. By labeling these questions as conspiracy thinking, institutions create a social cost for investigation. People self-censor to avoid association with marginalized ideas. Legitimate anomalies go unexamined because asking about them carries reputational risk. The suppression becomes self-perpetuating without requiring active conspiracy, just social pressure and professional incentives aligned toward maintaining consensus. But the evidence doesn't care about social pressure. Those buried cities still exist. Those architectural impossibilities still stand. The timeline still doesn't work. And once you see the pattern, the official explanations become obviously insufficient. Take the story of Seattle's underground city. The narrative says the Great Fire destroyed the wooden city, so they rebuilt with stone and raised the streets for better drainage and fire prevention. Reasonable on its surface. But then you look at what was buried. Those stone buildings with advanced foundations, that elaborate infrastructure, those construction techniques that exceed what we attribute to that era. And you realize the official story doesn't explain what you can still see beneath the modern streets. It just provides enough narrative cover that people stop asking questions. The pattern repeats in every buried city. Convenient disaster, rapid burial. Official explanation that sounds plausible until you examine the specifics. Chicago, San Francisco, Boston, each has a local story that discourages deeper investigation. But when you step back and see them as connected events, part of a coordinated pattern, the local explanations become obviously incomplete. So why the coordination? If these were truly independent local decisions, why the synchronized timeline? Why the shared methodology? Why the architectural consistency in what got buried? Unless there was communication, shared purpose, institutional direction guiding these seemingly separate urban renewal projects. Unless burying the evidence wasn't a side effect, it was the goal. Now I can't prove a formal conspiracy directed from some central authority. The evidence doesn't go that far. But the pattern is undeniable. Within a 70-year window, dozens of major cities across multiple continents all experienced similar disasters. All responded with massive burial projects. All erased architectural evidence that challenges our historical timeline. Either that's an impossible coincidence or there was coordination. Those are the options. And if there was coordination, that means someone decided what needed to be hidden. Someone had the resources to execute these massive projects. Someone had the authority to ensure official histories would provide convenient explanations. That's not small-scale cover-up. That's institutional power deployed systematically to reshape our understanding of the past, which raises the ultimate question: what else did they erase? If they could bury entire cities, demolish World's Fair complexes, suppress architectural evidence across continents, what other historical truths were deemed too dangerous to preserve? How much of what we accept as established history is actually carefully constructed narrative designed to hide discontinuities in the official timeline? The buried cities are just the physical evidence we can still touch, still see, still document. But if that evidence has been systematically ignored for over a century, if institutions refuse to investigate obvious anomalies, if asking questions carries professional and social cost, then we have to assume the suppression extends further into archaeology, where sites that don't fit the timeline get dismissed as anomalous, into textbooks, where simplified narratives replace complex reality, into the entire framework we use to understand human history, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you recognize the pattern of suppression, you start noticing it everywhere. Every time an anomaly gets dismissed without investigation. Every time evidence contradicts the narrative but gets ignored. Every time legitimate questions get labeled conspiracy thinking to avoid engagement. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. But here's the thing about suppressed information. It doesn't disappear completely. It leaves traces. Those buried cities are traces. The photographic evidence from World's Fairs is a trace. The architectural impossibilities in official timelines are traces. And increasingly, people are noticing, connecting the dots, asking questions that don't have good official answers. That's why channels like this exist. Because mainstream institutions won't investigate. Because official historians won't engage. Because someone needs to look at the evidence without predetermined conclusions about what we're allowed to find. And what we're finding doesn't fit the comfortable narrative we've been taught. The Tartarian civilization might be the correct explanation, or it might be one framework among several for understanding these anomalies. But regardless of what we call the lost culture that preceded us, the evidence demands we acknowledge something was there. Something got buried, something got erased, and someone decided we weren't supposed to know. So before we wrap up, I want you to subscribe if you haven't already, because we're just scratching the surface. The buried cities are one thread in a much larger tapestry of suppressed history. In upcoming videos, we'll examine the old world architecture that official history can't explain, the advanced technology hidden in plain sight in 19th century photographs, the systematic destruction of infrastructure that couldn't have been built with period-appropriate tools. Each thread connects to the others, building a picture that contradicts everything we've been taught. But I'll leave you with this question, the one that keeps me investigating. If our civilization is built on the ruins of something greater, if we've been living in the decaying remnants of advanced infrastructure we attribute to recent construction, if our entire historical framework is constructed to hide discontinuity in human development, what happens when enough people notice? What happens when the suppressed evidence becomes too obvious to ignore? What happens when we collectively realize we don't actually know our own history? Because those cities are still down there. That evidence is still accessible, and the official explanations are still insufficient. The pattern is too consistent to be coincidence, too coordinated to be independent, too systematic to be accidental. Someone buried those cities. Someone erased that evidence. Someone constructed the narrative we've inherited. The question isn't whether suppression happened. The buried cities prove it did. The question is why. What about our true history was so dangerous that it required systematic erasure? What knowledge did the old world possess that our current civilization wants forgotten? What would change if we acknowledged we're not the pinnacle of human achievement, but potentially the remnant struggling to understand what came before? I don't have all those answers, not yet. But the questions are valid. The evidence is real. And the silence from official institutions tells us more than they probably intend. Because if the explanations were simple, if the anomalies were easily explained, there wouldn't be silence. There would be investigation, documentation, transparent engagement with the evidence. Instead, we get dismissal, marginalization, social pressure against asking, which means the questions are threatening something. And whatever that something is, it's worth protecting, worth maintaining a century of careful narrative construction, worth burying cities to hide. So I'll ask you directly, what else don't they want you to see? What other evidence exists beneath the surface of accepted history? How much of what we think we know about our past is carefully constructed illusion, designed to prevent exactly these kinds of questions? The Tartarian cities buried overnight are just the beginning. They're the crack in the dam. And once you start pulling that thread, once you start noticing the patterns, the inconsistencies, the suppression, you realize our history is far stranger, far more complex, and far more deliberately obscured than official narratives suggest. Check out the next video in this series where we examine the impossible architecture still standing today. The structures that shouldn't exist according to official timelines but somehow do, built with techniques we supposedly didn't possess, displaying knowledge we supposedly didn't have. Because if they buried the evidence underground, that means what they couldn't bury, what they had to leave standing, becomes even more valuable for understanding what they're hiding. The pattern is there. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. And the more you look, the more impossible the official explanations become. Those cities didn't bury themselves. That evidence didn't erase itself. Someone did it deliberately. The only question is why, and what else they did that we haven't discovered yet.